A millionaire hired a humble farmer to take care of his mansion, but one day the businessman came home earlier and began to cry upon seeing what he had done to his entire family. The sun rose over the vast fields of the Thompson estate, tinting the sky with an intense gold that promised another day of abundant harvest. Michael Thompson, the owner of these fertile lands, watched from the window of his study, his gaze lost on the horizon. Behind him, the silence of the house dramatically contrasted with the bustle of the workers who were already beginning their tasks in the fields. Michael sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. At 50 years old, he was the very image of success. Owner of the most prosperous estate in the region, respected in business circles, and with a family that, from the outside, seemed perfect. However, the weight of that success felt like a millstone around his neck, and the silence of the house reminded him of the price he had paid for it. A gentle knock on the door pulled him from his reverie. "Come in," he said, turning to see Sarah, his wife, enter. Sarah, with her black hair neatly pulled into an elegant bun and her simple yet refined dress, was the picture of grace and composure. "Michael," she began, her voice soft but with a hint of firmness, "the new foreman is waiting outside. Do you remember that today was his first day?" Michael blinked, momentarily puzzled. He had completely forgotten about hiring the new employee. "Ah, yes, of course," he replied, trying to hide his oversight. "Please let him in." Sarah nodded and left the room. Moments later, a middle-aged man with sun-tanned skin and kind eyes entered the study. He respectfully removed his hat before speaking. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson. I'm Daniel Roberts, the new foreman for the gardens and smaller plantations." Michael watched him carefully. There was something in Daniel's calm presence that inspired confidence. "Welcome, Daniel. I hope you're ready for the work. The Thompson estate has high standards." Daniel nodded with a serene smile. "I'm here to give my best, sir. I've worked the land all my life and understand that every plant, every tree needs attention and care to thrive." These words caught Michael's attention. There was something in the way Daniel spoke about the land that resonated with him, reminding him of his own passion for agriculture, a passion that had lately seemed to fade under the weight of business and responsibilities. "Well said, Daniel," Michael responded, feeling a spark of his former enthusiasm. "Come, I'll show you the gardens and the areas that will be under your care." As they walked through the estate's grounds, Michael couldn't help but notice how Daniel occasionally paused to examine a plant or touch the soil with his calloused hands. His attention to detail and evident love for nature were admirable. "Mr. Thompson," Daniel said as they approached a particularly neglected area of the garden, "with your permission, I'd like to suggest some changes here. I see a lot of potential." Surprised by the new foreman's initiative, Michael nodded with curiosity. "Go ahead, Daniel. What do you have in mind?" Daniel began to explain his vision with enthusiasm, talking about how they could transform that forgotten corner into an oasis of color and life. His words painted such a vivid picture that Michael could almost see it, and for a moment he found himself dreaming of the possibilities. It was at that moment that a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Dad!" Michael turned to see his youngest daughter, Emily, running toward them. At only 12 years old, Emily was a whirlwind of energy and joy, so different from the silence that usually reigned in the house. "Emily!" Michael exclaimed, surprised by his daughter's sudden appearance. "What are you doing here? You should be at your classes." Emily's smile faltered slightly at her father's tone. "It's just, I wanted to show you something. I've been working on a project for school and thought maybe you could help me." Michael glanced at his watch, aware of the meetings awaiting him and the work still pending. Guilt mixed with frustration in his chest. "Emily, you know I'm busy during the day. See, can't it wait until tonight?" Disappointment was evident on his daughter's face, and Michael felt a pang of remorse. Before he could say anything else, Daniel intervened gently. "Miss Emily," he said, leaning down to the girl's level, "would you like to help me plan the new garden? I could use the opinion of someone with imagination." Emily's eyes lit up at the proposal, and Michael found himself once again surprised by Daniel's intuition. He watched as his daughter and the foreman began to discuss flowers and designs animatedly, feeling a mix of relief and a strange sense of loss. As he walked away to attend to his commitments, Michael couldn't help but look back. The image of Daniel and Emily, engrossed in their conversation about the garden, stayed with him. There was something in that scene that stirred an emotion he couldn't name, a feeling that something important was happening right before his eyes. Upon re-entering the house, the silence greeted him like an old acquaintance. But this time, for the first time in a long while, Michael wondered if that silence was truly a sign of peace, or if it hid something deeper, something he had been ignoring for too long. As he climbed the stairs to his study, his thoughts drifted to his other daughter, Victoria. At 16, Victoria was an enigma to him, distant and reserved. Michael couldn't remember the last time they had a real conversation, and that realization weighed heavily on his heart. He sat at his desk, surrounded by papers and reports, but his mind was far from the numbers and projections. For the first time in years, Michael Thompson found himself questioning the priorities that had guided his life up to that point. Outside, the sun continued its journey across the sky, bathing the estate in golden light. In the garden, Emily's laughter mingled with Daniel's calm voice, and somewhere in the house, Victoria remained silent. And so, unnoticed by anyone, a small seed of change began to germinate in the heart of the Thompson estate. Days on the Thompson estate began to pass with a new rhythm since Daniel's arrival. The garden, once neglected, started to show signs of renewed life, as if the very earth responded to the foreman's gentle touch. But it wasn't just the garden that was changing. A subtle shift was taking place in the very heart of the Thompson family. Michael, always absorbed in his business, found himself increasingly looking out the window of his study, watching Daniel work in the gardens. There was something in the way the foreman moved among the plants, with a mix of respect and affection, that stirred memories in Michael of his early days on the estate, when his love for the land was his primary motivation. One afternoon, while reviewing some contracts, Michael heard laughter coming from the garden. Curious, he peeked out the window and saw Emily helping Daniel plant some flowers. The girl, with her hands full of soil and a radiant smile, seemed happier than Michael had seen her in a long time. Without thinking twice, Michael left the papers on his desk and went out to the garden. As he approached, he could hear the conversation between his daughter and the foreman. "Do you see, Emily?" Daniel said softly. "Every seed is like a little miracle. It just needs good soil, water, sun, and a lot of love to grow strong and beautiful." Emily nodded enthusiastically. "Do you think the flowers will be ready for Victoria's birthday?" "I want to surprise her." Michael stopped dead in his tracks. Victoria's birthday? A chill ran down his spine as he realized he had no idea when his eldest daughter's birthday was. Guilt washed over him like a cold wave. "I'm sure they will be," Daniel replied with a smile. "And it will be a very special gift because you've nurtured it with your own hands." At that moment, Daniel looked up and saw Michael. With a respectful gesture, he greeted him. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thompson. Would you like to join us?" Emily turned, surprised to see her father out of his study at that hour. "Dad, do you want to help us plant?" Michael hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the unsigned contracts on his desk, but something in his daughter's hopeful gaze made him decide. "Of course," he said, approaching and kneeling beside them. "What are we planting?" For the next hour, Michael immersed himself in a world he had forgotten. The feel of moist earth, the scent of plants, the satisfaction of creating life with his own hands. Emily chattered happily, telling him about her plans for the garden and how she hoped to surprise Victoria. "Dad," Emily said suddenly with a seriousness beyond her years, "do you think Victoria will like it? Lately she seems so sad." Michael felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. When was the last time he had truly talked to Victoria? How had he not noticed that his daughter was sad? "I'm sure she'll love it," he replied, trying to hide his turmoil. "It's a very nice gesture on your part, Emily." Daniel, who had been quietly observing the interaction, intervened gently. "You know, sometimes plants, like people, need time to bloom, but with patience and consistent care, they always find a way to show their beauty." Michael looked at Daniel, surprised by the depth of his words. For a moment, he felt as though the foreman was speaking about something more than just plants. As the sun began to set, tinting the sky with oranges and pinks, Michael realized he had spent the entire afternoon in the garden. Surprisingly, he didn't feel remorse for the unfinished work. Instead, he felt renewed. "Thank you, Daniel," Michael said as he stood, brushing the dirt from his pants. For the gardening lesson and for everything else. Daniel nodded with a serene smile. It's a pleasure, sir. Sometimes working the land helps us see things more clearly. That evening during dinner, the Thompson family sat together at the table as they hadn't in a long time. Sarah, surprised by the change in her husband's routine, watched with curiosity as Michael listened attentively to Emily talk about her projects in the garden. Victoria, sitting silently at the other end of the table, cast furtive glances at her father as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. When their eyes met, Michael saw something that shook him to his core, a mix of longing and distrust that broke his heart. "Victoria," Michael said, breaking the silence that had settled between them, "I'd like you to show me your paintings tomorrow. Emily told me you've been working on something new." Surprise was evident on Victoria's face, quickly replaced by cautious hope. "Sure, Dad," she replied softly, "if you really want to see them." "Of course I do," Michael affirmed, realizing how much he had lost by not paying attention to his daughter's passions. Sarah watched the exchange with a mix of emotions on her face. It had been so long since she had seen her family interact this way that it almost felt like a dream. After dinner, as Michael prepared for bed, he couldn't stop thinking about the day's events. The afternoon in the garden with Emily, Daniel's wise words, the look in Victoria's eyes. Everything blended in his mind, creating a sense of unease and at the same time of possibility. He lay down beside Sarah, who looked at him with an inscrutable expression. "It's been an interesting day," she remarked, her voice a mix of curiosity and caution. "Yes, it has," Michael replied, feeling the weight of years of distance between them. "Sarah, Shh," she gently interrupted, placing a finger on his lips. "Don't say anything right now. Words are easy, Michael. Tomorrow is a new day. Let's see what it brings." With those words, Sarah turned off the light, leaving Michael in the darkness with his thoughts. As sleep enveloped him, he couldn't help but think about the seeds they had planted that day in the garden. What would bloom from them? And more importantly, what was beginning to blossom in his own family? The silence of the night enveloped the Thompson estate, but it was no longer the cold and distant silence of before. It was a silence full of promises, possibilities, and hope. And somewhere on the vast grounds, the new seeds planted were beginning their slow and miraculous journey toward the surface, oblivious to the human drama unfolding around them, yet somehow inexorably connected to it. The next morning dawned with a different light on the Thompson estate. Michael woke up before dawn, a habit he had lost over the years, but which today, inexplicably, had returned. He dressed silently, careful not to wake Sarah, and stepped outside the house. The fresh morning air greeted him, filled with the scent of moist earth and newly bloomed flowers. He walked along the garden paths, observing how the first light of day revealed the work that Daniel and Emily had been doing. It was as if he was seeing the place for the first time, noticing details that had previously gone unnoticed. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson." Daniel's calm voice startled him. The foreman was standing next to a rosebush, his hands stained with soil and a serene expression on his face. "Daniel," Michael greeted, surprised not to be the only early riser. "I didn't expect to find anyone here so early." Daniel smiled. "The early hours of the day are the best for the garden, sir. It's when the plants are most receptive, more honest, if you allow me to say." Michael nodded, intrigued by the way Daniel spoke of the plants as if they were people. "Honest?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Yes," Daniel replied, gently stroking a rosebud. "In the morning, before the day's heat forces them to close up, plants show exactly what they need. If they're thirsty, their leaves will be drooping. If they're lacking nutrients, their color won't be right." Michael pondered this, realizing there might be deeper lessons to learn from the plants and the people tending to them. It's the best time to understand and care for them. Michael remained silent, reflecting on Daniel's words. He couldn't help but think about his family, about how he had failed to read their needs for so long. "Daniel," he finally said, "how did you learn so much about gardens and plants?" The foreman stood tall, looking toward the horizon where the sun was beginning to rise. "It was my father who taught me, Mr. Thompson. He was a simple man, but wise. He used to say that taking care of a garden is like taking care of a family. It requires constant attention, patience, and above all, love." Daniel's words resonated deeply with Michael. He thought of his own father, the lessons he had been given about managing the estate, but somehow they had omitted these deeper truths. "Your father sounds like he was a very wise man," Michael commented. Daniel nodded with a melancholic smile. "He was. He taught me that roots are as important as the flowers. Without strong and deep roots, not even the most beautiful plant can survive the storms." Before Michael could respond, they heard footsteps approaching. It was Victoria, dressed in paint-splattered clothes, looking as surprised to see them as they were to see her. "Victoria," Michael said, remembering his promise from the night before. "You're up early." "Yes," she replied, her tone mixing surprise and caution. "Morning light is special for painting." Michael felt a pang of recognition. How many times had his daughter gone out like this, early in the morning, to capture the dawn light in her paintings without him noticing? "Would you like to show me your work now?" he asked, trying not to sound too anxious. Victoria hesitated for a moment, as if evaluating the sincerity of the request. Finally, she nodded. "All right. Follow me." Daniel, sensing the intimate moment, discreetly excused himself and returned to his duties. Michael followed his daughter to a small shed at the end of the garden that had been converted into an improvised art studio. Upon entering, Michael was breathless. The walls were covered with canvases, each brimming with color and life. Landscapes of the estate, portraits of workers, scenes of everyday life. Every painting told a story, capturing the essence of life on the estate in a way Michael had never seen before. "Victoria," he murmured, genuinely impressed. "This is extraordinary." His daughter looked at him with a mix of pride and vulnerability. "Do you really think so?" "Absolutely," Michael replied, approaching a canvas that depicted the old oak tree by the stream, a place he himself had frequented in his youth. "You have an incredible gift." Victoria smiled timidly, the first glimpse of real warmth Michael had seen in her in a long time. "Thank you, Dad." For the next hour, Victoria showed her father her works, explaining the techniques she had learned and the challenges she had faced. Michael listened attentively, asking questions, genuinely interested. With every word exchanged, he felt a bridge being built over the chasm that had separated them for so long. Suddenly, Michael stopped in front of a canvas covered with a cloth. "And this one?" he asked, curious. Victoria seemed to hesitate. That one is special. It's not finished yet." Gently, Michael lifted the cloth, revealing a half-finished portrait. He was breathless as he recognized the faces. It was a family portrait, with him, Sarah, Victoria, and Emily. But what struck him most was the expression on his own painted face. Distant, absent, as if he were physically present, but his mind was elsewhere. "Oh, Victoria," he whispered, feeling a lump in his throat. "I'm sorry," she quickly said, moving her hand to cover the canvas again. "I shouldn't—" "No," Michael interrupted, gently taking her hand. "Don't feel bad. It's perfect. Painfully perfect." Their gazes met, and for a moment all the unspoken words, all the years of distance, seemed to float between them. "Do you think," Michael began, his voice trembling, "that we could work together to finish it? Maybe we could create a new portrait, one that reflects how I want us to be from now on." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "I'd like that, Dad." As they left the studio, the sun was already high in the sky. Sarah was waiting for them on the terrace, a look of surprise and hope on her face as she saw them together. "Breakfast is ready," she announced, her voice soft but full of unasked questions. Michael looked at his wife, then at his daughter, and finally toward the garden where Daniel was diligently working. He felt as if he were viewing his life from a new perspective, as if the roots of his family, long neglected, were beginning to strengthen once again. "Let's go," he said, putting an arm around Victoria's shoulders and extending the other toward Sarah. "We have a lot to talk about." As the family headed toward the house, Michael couldn't help but think about Daniel's words regarding deep roots. Perhaps, he thought, it wasn't too late to nurture those roots, to help his family grow strong and united, capable of facing any storm that might come their way. The aroma of coffee and freshly baked bread enveloped them as they entered the house, mingling with the fragrance of the garden flowers. It was the scent of home, of new beginnings, of the possibilities that lay before them. And for the first time in a long time, Michael Thompson felt that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The following days at the Thompson estate passed with a palpable atmosphere of change. Michael, inspired by his recent connection with Victoria, made a conscious effort to be more present in his family's life. However, years of ingrained habits don't fade overnight, and the path to reconciliation was far from simple. One morning, as Michael was reviewing some documents in his study, he heard a commotion coming from the kitchen. Curious, he got up from his desk and headed there. Upon entering, he found a chaotic scene. Emily, covered in flour from head to toe, struggling to control an electric mixer that seemed to have a mind of its own. Cake batter splattered the walls and floor, and in the midst of it all, Daniel was trying to calm the situation. "Emily!" Michael exclaimed, surprised. "What's going on here?" The girl, her eyes filled with tears of frustration, released the mixer. I just wanted to make a cake for Victoria's birthday, but everything went wrong." Michael felt a pang of guilt. He had been so busy trying to reconnect with Victoria that he had neglected Emily. He approached his youngest daughter, and to everyone's surprise, even his own, hugged her, not caring that his suit was now stained with flour and batter. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said softly. "Accidents happen. The important thing is the intention." Daniel, who had been watching silently, intervened with his usual wisdom. "Miss Emily, you know, in the garden, sometimes we plant seeds and they don't grow as we expected. But that doesn't mean we should give up. We just learn and try again." Michael looked at Daniel with gratitude. "Daniel is right. How about we clean up this mess and then try making the cake together?" Emily's eyes lit up. "Really? You'd help me, Dad?" "Of course," Michael replied, realizing how much he had missed these moments with his daughter. "Though I must warn you, my culinary skills are pretty limited." As they cleaned the kitchen, Sarah entered, drawn by the noise. Her expression of surprise upon seeing Michael with rolled-up sleeves, cleaning the floor alongside Emily, was indescribable. "Michael," she began with a mix of astonishment and caution in her voice, "you have an important video conference in half an hour with the investors from New York City." Michael stopped, the weight of his business responsibilities clashing with his newly discovered desire to be present for his family. He looked at Emily, then at Sarah, and finally at Daniel, who was watching him with a serene but expectant expression. In that moment, Michael made a decision. "Sarah, could you reschedule the call for tomorrow? There's something important I need to do today." Sarah blinked, surprised. "But Michael, these investors have been waiting for this meeting for weeks. It's crucial for the expansion of the estate." "I know," Michael replied, standing up. "But there are more important things than expansion. I'll explain the situation to them. If they're the right partners for us, they'll understand." As Sarah left to make the call, visibly unsettled by this new Michael, Daniel approached him. "Mr. Thompson, if I may say so, you've just made a very wise decision. Sometimes, for something to grow strong, it's necessary to prune other branches." Michael nodded, grateful for Daniel's silent support. "Thank you, Daniel. I think I'm just beginning to understand that." The rest of the morning passed amidst laughter, flying flour, and the sweet aroma of baking cake. Michael discovered, to his surprise, that he thoroughly enjoyed the task. He saw Emily in a new light, appreciating her determination and creativity. When Victoria returned from her art class in the afternoon, she found a scene she never would have imagined. Her father and younger sister, covered in flour, proudly presenting a slightly lopsided but lovingly made cake. "Happy birthday, Victoria," Michael said with a shy smile. "I know it's a bit early, but Emily was so excited we couldn't wait." Victoria looked at the cake, then at her father and sister, and finally at her mother, who was watching the scene from the doorway with a mix of emotions on her face. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, to everyone's surprise, Victoria began to laugh. It wasn't a mocking laugh, but a genuine one, full of joy and perhaps a bit of relief. "It's perfect," she said finally, hugging Emily, and then, after a moment of hesitation, Michael. As the family gathered around the table to enjoy the cake, Sarah approached Michael. "The investors understood," she said quietly, "but they want a detailed explanation tomorrow." Michael nodded, aware that his actions today would have consequences for the future. But looking at his family gathered together, he felt that for the first time in a long time, his priorities were in the right place. However, not everything was rosy, was. Later that night, when the day's excitement had settled, Michael found Sarah on the terrace looking out over the garden illuminated by moonlight. "Sarah," he began, approaching her, "I know these changes must be unsettling for you." She turned to look at him, her eyes shining with unspoken tears. "Michael, don't get me wrong. I'm glad to see these changes in you, in our family. But, Michael asked, feeling a pang of anxiety. "But I'm scared," Sarah admitted. "Scared that this might be temporary, that you might dive back into work and leave us behind again. I don't know if I could bear that disappointment once more." Sarah's words hit Michael like a punch in the stomach. He realized how much his negligence had hurt over the years, and how fragile this new family dynamic truly was. "Sarah," he said, taking her hands in his, "I can't promise it will be easy. I'm learning, making mistakes, trying to be better, but I promise I won't give up. Our family is the most important thing to me, more than any business or expansion." Sarah looked into his eyes, searching for truth in his words. Finally, she nodded slightly. "All right, Michael. Let's give this a chance. Together." As they embraced under the moonlight, with the scent of garden flowers floating in the air, Michael realized that this was just the beginning. The path to true reconciliation and change would be long and filled with challenges. But for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. Hopeful that, like the plants in Daniel's garden, his family could grow stronger, more united, capable of weathering any storm the future might bring. In the distance, the city lights flickered, reminding Michael that the outside world, with all its demands and expectations, was still there. Tomorrow, he would have to face the consequences of his decisions today. But for tonight, in this moment, he was exactly where he needed to be. The next morning dawned with palpable tension at the Thompson estate. Michael woke up early, his mind divided between the warmth of the previous day's family events and the impending video conference with the investors from New York City. He dressed in his most formal suit, a suit of armor against the business world that now seemed so distant from the life he was beginning to value. As he adjusted his tie in the mirror, Sarah entered the room. Their gazes met in the reflection, a silent conversation passing between them. "Are you ready?" Sarah asked, her voice blending support and concern. Michael nodded, turning to face her. "I have to be. This meeting could change the future of the estate." Sarah approached, smoothing the lapels of his jacket with a familiar gesture. "Just remember why you're doing this, Michael." "For whom?" With one last squeeze on his shoulder, Sarah left the room, leaving Michael lost in his thoughts. Minutes later, he was in his study, in front of his computer screen, waiting for the call to begin. The serious faces of the investors appeared on the screen, their expressions a mix of curiosity and mild irritation. Michael took a deep breath and began his explanation. "Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I want to thank you for your understanding regarding the schedule change," he began. "Yesterday I made a decision that might seem imprudent from a purely business perspective, but I believe it's fundamental for the future of the Thompson estate." As Michael spoke about the importance of family, about how the true value of the estate lay not just in its fields and products, but in the people who made it run, he noticed a subtle change in the investors' expressions. Some appeared skeptical, others intrigued. "What I'm proposing," Michael continued, feeling a newfound confidence grow within him, "is an approach that integrates the well-being of our workers and their families with the expansion and modernization of the estate. I firmly believe that this is not only morally right, but will also give us a unique competitive advantage in the market." The discussion that followed was intense. The investors questioned the financial viability of the plan, expressed concerns about timelines and returns on investment. Michael stood firm, backing up his arguments with data and projections, but also with a passion that even surprised himself. After what seemed like an eternity, the leader of the group of investors, a stern-faced man named Alexander Vega, spoke. "Mr. Thompson, your proposal is unconventional. However, we cannot deny that there is merit in your arguments. We will need time to review the details and consult with our advisors." Michael nodded, aware that this was not a direct rejection, but neither a victory. "I understand, Mr. Vega. I appreciate your consideration and will be happy to provide any additional information you may need." When the call ended, Michael leaned back in his chair, exhausted but with a sense of accomplishment. He had defended his new convictions in front of one of the biggest challenges of his career. He left his study to find Sarah waiting anxiously in the hallway. "How did it go?" she asked. "It was tough," Michael admitted, "but I think I managed to get them to see my point of view. Now all that's left is to wait." Sarah hugged him, a gesture that had become more frequent in recent days. "I'm proud of you, Michael. Whatever the outcome, you've done the right thing." As they walked together to the kitchen, they encountered Daniel coming from the garden with a basket full of fresh vegetables. The foreman greeted them with a smile, but Michael noticed a shadow of concern in his eyes. "Daniel," Michael said, "is everything okay?" Daniel hesitated for a moment before replying, "Mr. Thompson, there's something you should see in the eastern fields." Intrigued and a bit alarmed, Michael followed Daniel to the fields. As they approached, Michael noticed that something was wrong. The plants, which should have been thriving, looked wilted and weak. "What's happening?" Michael asked, kneeling to examine the plants more closely. Daniel crouched beside him. "It seems to be a new pest, sir. I've never seen anything like this in this region. If we don't act quickly, we could lose the entire eastern harvest." Michael felt the ground move beneath his feet. The loss of this harvest would be a devastating blow, especially now that he was trying to convince the investors of his new approach. "What can we do?" he asked, trying to stay calm. Daniel shook his head. "Traditional pesticides won't work against this. We need to look for a more natural solution. I know an agronomist in the city who has been experimenting with organic pest control methods. It might be our best option." Michael nodded, feeling the weight of the decision on his shoulders. Organic methods were more expensive and less tested, but aligned with the vision he had just presented to the investors. "Do it," he said finally. "Contact that agronomist and do whatever it takes to save the harvest." As they returned to the house, Michael couldn't help but feel like he was walking a tightrope. On one side, his family and his new commitment to a more ethical and sustainable approach. On the other, the harsh reality of business and the expectations of the investors. On the terrace, they found Victoria painting, her strokes capturing the beauty of the sunset over the fields. Michael paused to watch her, marveling at his daughter's talent and how she seemed to see beauty even in moments of uncertainty. "Victoria," he called softly. When she turned, he continued, "Would you like to visit the art gallery in the city tomorrow? I think it's time your talent is recognized beyond the estate." Victoria's eyes lit up with a mix of surprise and excitement. "Really, Dad?" "And your work?" Michael smiled, despite the worry he felt about the situation in the fields. "My most important work is being your father. The rest can wait a day." As Victoria hugged him enthusiastically, Michael exchanged a glance with Sarah, who was watching from the doorway. In her eyes, he saw understanding and support, but also a silent warning. They both knew they were navigating turbulent waters, and that the decisions they made in the coming days could change the course of their lives forever. That night, as the family dined together, sharing laughs and plans for the future, Michael felt torn between the joy of the moment and the anxiety about what was to come. He looked around at the faces of the people he loved most and vowed to himself that no matter what happened, he wouldn't lose sight of what truly mattered. Outside, in the fields darkened by the night, the threat of the pest loomed, a shadow over the estate's future. But inside the house, lit by the warm glow of lamps and familial affection, Michael Thompson found the strength to face any challenge that tomorrow might bring. Organic methods are slower, but in the long run, they will keep the land fertile and healthy. Chemical pesticides offer a quick solution, but they could have negative consequences in the future. As the discussion continued, Michael noticed that Victoria seemed to want to say something, but hesitated. "Victoria," he encouraged her, "what do you think?" Victoria seemed surprised to be asked her opinion, but mustered up the courage and spoke. "Dad, I know I don't know much about agriculture, but what if we use this as an opportunity? We could document the entire process of combating the pest organically. I could create a series of paintings showing the challenges and triumphs. It could be a way to educate others about sustainable agriculture." The room fell silent for a moment, surprised by Victoria's innovative idea. Michael felt a wave of pride for his daughter. Emily, not wanting to be left behind, added enthusiastically, "And I could help make videos for social media, showing how everyone works together to save the harvest responsibly." The energy in the room changed. What had begun as a discussion about a crisis was turning into a brainstorming session on how to turn this challenge into an opportunity. Sarah, who had been listening attentively, spoke. "Michael, do you remember what you told the investors about how we wanted the Thompson estate to be an example of responsible and sustainable agriculture? This could be our opportunity to demonstrate it." Michael looked around at the expectant faces surrounding him. He saw worry, yes, but also determination and hope. At that moment, he knew what he had to do. "All right," he said finally, "we'll do it. We'll combat this pest organically. It will be difficult. It will require more work and patience from all of us. But we'll do it together, as a family, as a community." A murmur of approval ran through the room. Daniel smiled, nodding respectfully. Dr. Ramirez immediately began outlining a plan of action. "One more thing," Michael added. "From now on, we'll make important decisions together. This estate is not just mine, it's ours. And together, we'll make it prosper." As the meeting dispersed, with small groups animatedly discussing the next steps, Michael found himself surrounded by his family. Sarah hugged him tightly, whispering, "I'm proud of you," in his ear. Victoria and Emily, excited to be included and valued, were already planning how to document this new adventure. That night, as Michael prepared for bed, he reflected on the day's events. He knew the road ahead would be difficult. The investors might not be happy, the harvest was still in danger, and they were betting a lot on this new approach. But for the first time in a long while, he felt truly at peace with the decision. He looked out the window toward the fields illuminated by the moon, fields that had been his family's livelihood for generations. Now, those same fields would become a symbol of change, responsibility, unity. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked, joining him at the window. Michael hugged her, grateful for her constant strength and support. "About the future," he replied. "About the seeds we're planting today, not just in the fields, but in our lives. About the harvest that will come, not just of crops, but of changes, of growth." Sarah rested her head on Michael's shoulder. "It will be a difficult path," she said. "It will," Michael nodded. "But we'll walk it together, and that makes everything worthwhile." As the couple gazed at the night in the fields beyond the window, the plants silently fought against the pest that threatened their existence. But now, they had an entire community united to support them, to nurture not just the roots in the soil, but the bonds that connected everyone at the Thompson estate. The true harvest, Michael realized, would be the transformation of his family, his community, and his legacy. And that, he thought with a smile, would be the most valuable harvest of all. Days at the Thompson estate transformed into a whirlwind of frenetic activity. The decision to combat the pest organically had infused everyone with a new sense of purpose, but it had also brought with it a series of unexpected challenges. Michael found himself in the middle of it all, dividing his time between overseeing the efforts in the fields, coordinating with Dr. Ramirez, and keeping the investors informed about the progress. The long hours and constant stress were beginning to take their toll, but he remained steadfast in his determination. One morning, while walking through the fields with Daniel, Michael noticed something that made him stop dead in his tracks. Amid the plants affected by the pest, a small green sprout stood up, seemingly immune to the disease that was ravaging his neighbors. "Daniel, look at this," Michael called, kneeling to examine the resilient sprout more closely. Daniel approached, his eyes lighting up with interest. "Incredible," he murmured. "It seems this plant has developed a natural resistance to the pest." Michael felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. "Do you think we could use this in some way? Reproduce this resistance in other plants?" Daniel nodded slowly, his mind working on the possibilities. "It could be the key we were looking for, sir. We should inform Dr. Ramirez immediately." Michael nodded, feeling the weight of the decision on his shoulders. Organic methods were more expensive and less tested, but aligned with the vision he had just presented to the investors. "Do it," he said finally. "Contact that agronomist and do whatever it takes to save the harvest." As they returned to the house, Michael couldn't help but feel like he was walking a tightrope. On one side, his family and his new commitment to a more ethical and sustainable approach. On the other, the harsh reality of business and the expectations of the investors. On the terrace, they found Victoria painting, her strokes capturing the beauty of the sunset over the fields. Michael paused to watch her, marveling at his daughter's talent and how she seemed to see beauty even in moments of uncertainty. "Victoria," he called softly. When she turned, he continued, "Would you like to visit the art gallery in the city tomorrow? I think it's time your talent is recognized beyond the estate." Victoria's eyes lit up with a mix of surprise and excitement. "Really, Dad? And your work?" Michael smiled, despite the worry he felt about the situation in the fields. "My most important work is being your father. The rest can wait a day." As Victoria hugged him enthusiastically, Michael exchanged a glance with Sarah, who was watching them from the doorway. In her eyes, he saw understanding and support, but also a silent warning. They both knew they were navigating turbulent waters, and that the decisions they made in the coming days could change the course of their lives forever. That night, as the family dined together, sharing laughs and plans for the future, Michael found himself torn between the joy of the moment and the anxiety about what was to come. He looked around at the faces of the people he loved most and vowed to himself that no matter what happened, he wouldn't lose sight of what truly mattered. Outside, in the fields bathed in moonlight, the threat of the pest lurked, a shadow over the estate's future. But inside the house, lit by the warm glow of lamps and familial affection, Michael Thompson found the strength to face any challenge that tomorrow might bring. The next day dawned with a mix of expectation and anxiety at the Thompson estate. Michael found himself awake before dawn, his mind divided between the promise of a day with Victoria at the art gallery and the growing concern about the pest in the eastern fields. He dressed silently, trying not to wake Sarah, and went out to walk through the gardens. The fresh morning air carried the scent of newly opened flowers, mixed with the smell of moist earth. Daniel was already working, his figure outlined against the horizon that was beginning to light up. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," Daniel greeted as he saw Michael approaching. "Early today?" Michael nodded, watching as Daniel carefully examined the plants. "Any news about the agronomist?" "Yes, sir," Daniel replied, standing up. "He'll arrive this afternoon to examine the affected fields. He says he's had success with similar methods on other estates." Michael felt a momentary relief, but knew they were far from solving the problem. "Good. Keep me informed of everything. Today I'll take Victoria to the city, but I'll be available if you need me." Daniel nodded, a slight smile appearing on his sun-weathered face. "It's good for you to spend time with your daughter, sir. Plants aren't the only things that need care and attention to grow strong." Michael smiled, grateful once again for Daniel's simple yet profound wisdom. He returned to the house to find Victoria already awake, her enthusiasm for the day ahead palpable. The trip to the city was a moment of connection between father and daughter. Victoria chatted animatedly about her artistic projects, her dreams and aspirations. Michael listened attentively, marveling at how much his daughter had grown and how much he had missed during the years he had been immersed in work. The art gallery was an elegant building in downtown. Upon entering, they were greeted by Sophia Mendoza, the gallery owner, a middle-aged woman with a keen eye for talent. "Mr. Thompson, it's a pleasure to see you," Sophia greeted, before turning her attention to Victoria. "And you must be the young artist I've heard so much about." Victoria, normally confident with her art, seemed nervous under the professional scrutiny. Michael placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Go ahead, sweetheart. Show Ms. Mendoza your work." With trembling hands, Victoria opened her portfolio. Sophia examined each piece attentively, her eyes lighting up with each new artwork she saw. "Victoria," Sophia said finally, "you have an extraordinary talent. The way you capture the essence of rural life, the light, the colors. It's impressive." Michael felt his chest swell with pride as he watched his daughter's radiant smile. Sophia continued, "I'd like to feature some of your works in our upcoming Young Talents exhibition. What do you think?" Victoria looked at her father, seeking his approval. Michael nodded enthusiastically. "It's a wonderful opportunity, sweetheart. You should accept it." As Victoria and Sophia discussed the details of the exhibition, Michael's phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a message from Sarah. "The agronomist has arrived. The situation is worse than we thought." Michael felt his stomach drop. He wanted to be there for Victoria at this important moment, but he knew he couldn't ignore the crisis at the estate. He approached his daughter and spoke quietly. "Victoria, an emergency has arisen at the estate. Will you be okay if I leave now? I can send the driver to pick you up later." A brief look of disappointment crossed Victoria's face, but she nodded with understanding. "It's okay, Dad, I understand. Go, I'll stay a bit longer with Miss Mendoza." Michael kissed his daughter's forehead and hurriedly said goodbye. During the entire trip back to the estate, his mind oscillated between the joy of Victoria's success and the worry of what he would find at home. Upon arrival, he found Sarah, Daniel, and a man he assumed was the agronomist, gathered at the edge of the affected field. Their somber expressions told him everything he needed to know even before they spoke. "Michael," Sarah began, her voice tense, "Dr. Ramirez says the pest is more resistant than we thought. Organic methods might work, but they would take time. Time we don't have if we want to save the harvest." Dr. Ramirez, a man with an academic appearance and thick-rimmed glasses, nodded gravely. "Mr. Thompson, I'm afraid the pest is more resilient than we initially thought. Traditional chemical pesticides could eliminate the pest, but it would contaminate the soil," Michael finished, feeling the weight of the decision on his shoulders. Daniel, who had been silent until then, spoke. "Sir, I know we promised the investors a more sustainable approach, but if we lose this harvest..." Michael closed his eyes, feeling the world close in around him. On one side, there was the financial future of the estate, the jobs of hundreds of workers who depended on him. On the other, there was the commitment he had made, not just to the investors, but to himself and his family, to do things differently, to be an example of responsible agriculture. "I need time to think," he said finally. "Dr. Ramirez, can you stay another day? I want to explore all our options before making a decision." The agronomist nodded, understanding. As the group dispersed, Sarah approached Michael. "How was your day with Victoria?" she asked, trying to lighten the mood. Michael's smile was bittersweet. "Wonderful. The gallery wants to exhibit her work. Our daughter has a bright future ahead." Sarah took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his, "And thanks to you, she now knows. Michael, no matter what happens with the estate, don't forget how important your presence is in our daughters' lives." That night, as the family dined together, Michael watched Victoria excitedly share details of her upcoming exhibition. Emily listened admiringly to her older sister, her eyes shining with her own dreams. Sarah, sitting beside him, kept a comforting hand over his under the table. At that moment, surrounded by the love and joy of his family, Michael knew that no matter how difficult the decision he had to make, he would find a way to protect both his family and the land that had been home for generations. Meanwhile, in the fields darkened by night, the pest continued its silent advance, an invisible threat that would test not only the resilience of the plants, but also the strength and values of the Thompson family. The market for organic and sustainable products is growing, and your story, well, it's the kind of story that sells itself. A smile began to form on Michael's face, but he held it back, waiting for the final words. "We've decided not only to keep our investment," Vega announced, "but to increase it. We want to be part of this new chapter of Thompson Estate, with one condition." "And what would that condition be?" Michael asked cautiously. "That you maintain this collaborative approach to decision-making. What we've seen today is the result of teamwork, of a family working together. We want to see more of that." The tension in the room eased, replaced by a wave of relief and joy. Emily was the first to break the silence with a cheer, quickly followed by hugs and congratulations from everyone present. Amid the celebration, Michael found himself gazing out the window toward the fields. The afternoon sun bathed the land in a golden glow, and for a moment he could see the future unfolding before him. Prosperous fields, a united community, a strong family. Sarah approached him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "We did it," she whispered. Michael smiled, holding her tightly. "No, my love. We did it together, all of us." That evening, Thompson Estate buzzed with the energy of an impromptu celebration. Workers, family, and even the investors mingled, sharing food, music, and laughter. Victoria unveiled a new painting, a portrait of the Thompson family surrounded by the estate community, with the fertile fields stretching out in the background. It was an image of unity, hope, and a bright future built on deep, strong roots. As the celebration continued, Michael slipped away for a moment, walking to the edge of the fields. Daniel found him there, both of them gazing at the stars. "A good harvest, wouldn't you say, sir?" the foreman remarked with a smile. Michael nodded, his heart full of gratitude. "The best, Daniel. And I'm not just talking about the crops. The best harvests," Daniel reflected, "are the ones that nourish not just the body, but also the soul. And that's what we've achieved here." Michael placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, grateful for the man's constant wisdom and support. Back at the party, Michael watched his family. Sarah, radiant and relaxed for the first time in weeks. Victoria, passionately explaining her art to a group of interested investors. Emily, teaching some of the younger workers how to edit videos on her tablet. At that moment, Michael Thompson understood that true wealth wasn't measured in acres or bank balances, but in the bonds that connected people, in the love they cultivated each day, and in the strength they found together in the face of adversity. Thompson Estate had faced its greatest challenge and had emerged not only intact but transformed. And as the night continued, filled with music, laughter and promises of a bright future, Michael knew this was only the first of many harvests of the heart yet to come.